Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The Bowery Residents Committee was formed in 1971 when a small group of men living in flop houses on Skid Row decided they wanted to change their lives and knew they needed help. Today, the BRC is one of the city's most comprehensive social service agencies, and it provides housing, social services, and hope to well over 10,000 people. Muzzy Rosenblatt is its executive director, and he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thanks, Ronnie. Good to be with you. Good to see you.
Thank you. So it's a very big organization that you're
is.
overseeing. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, you did a phenomenal job introducing it. But here we are some 40 odd years after we were founded by men just looking for a chance for a better life, who didn't have a lot, but who believed that there was still hope for them and some things that they wanted to achieve. They know they had made mistakes, they knew they had challenges, but they had not given up on themselves. And so today, obviously, the plight of addiction, the plight of homelessness, the plight of poverty persists. And what we try to do is continue in that spirit of giving people an opportunity. What we like to say is a hand up instead of a hand out.
Whatever happened to the original guys, do you know?
Most of them sadly have passed on. There are a few who are left. We are still in one of the old flop houses on the Bowery, the Palace, on Bowery and Bleecker. And of course the Bowery's changed dramatically.
And how?
But we haven't stood in its way, and we peacefully coexist.
Do you own the building?
Side. We don't. We have a very long lease on it, thankfully. I don't know that we could afford it in this market. But that is the story of New York. And you know, as you remark, we don't really have a Skid Row anymore in New York. In some ways that's good. We haven't ghettoized poverty to the degree that it used to be. There are definitely poverty pockets. But for our work, our niche of the world, we're dealing with people who are very transient, who have, again, like our founders, had a host of challenges in their life. They're not perfect, their lives haven't been perfect, but they still want a chance for something better. They've been institutionalized, sometimes they've been incarcerated, they've paid their dues, and now where do they go? The Bowery isn't affordable, there's no affordable housing, and their needs are significant, not just for income and employment, but to overcome addiction, overcome mental illness, overcome health, and health. The health issues are dramatic as well.
You know, when I first got involved, this was back in the Lindsay days, a lot of the homelessness was caused by urban renewal areas and people who used to live in rooming houses that somehow managed to do much better than SROs. I mean, they were privately owned, meals were served sometime, and they were in a rooming house, but they were evicted and then they started in shelters and different stuff. It was considered a much, I guess the mental institutions hadn't started putting people out on the street. So it was a whole different world. Now, we also have increasingly number of homeless people, just so many more, and people who are on the streets with the problems that you're trying to solve. You were once the commissioner of homeless services in the city?
Acting commissioner, yes.
Acting commissioner, well, commissioner, why not?
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Ronnie.
Thank you. We could go this way all the time. But there are more homeless people now than there were then.
It's different. You know, we're counting now, which is great. It's hard to measure results and really understand and focus on a problem if you don't really measure it. But you know, what you do with the data is important as well. And so it's different. You know, it's more visible now because, to your point, the needs are the same. We still have poor individuals who have needs, but in the old days they could be self-reliant and in a flop house. Whether that was good or not, out of sight, out of mind. It didn't cure their addiction, it didn't cure their mental illness, it didn't cure their poverty, but we didn't see them as much. So one of the kind of unintended consequences of the economic revitalization of the city, for many people, including poor people, obviously, and homelessness, is fewer affordable places to live. There's no question that but not a part of the solution to the homeless challenge in New York is, I hate the term affordable housing, housing for very poor people, people who are earning, we have a wonderful employment program. There are jobs, and BRC clients, 274 of them last year, went back into the workforce. 63% of them still working 6 months later, because again, it's about measuring, not just getting a job, but keeping a job at average wages of over $10 an hour. But at that, you can afford $500 a month.
Yeah, and you can't find a place.
And you can't find a place, and for that matter, it's getting harder and harder for even nonprofits to develop. We used to use Section 8, the federal housing voucher, to bridge the gap between what somebody could afford and what it costs just at a profitless basis to run housing. And Section 8 is gone, especially with sequestration. There's
And
just
that's
no
the federal
more.
program.
That's the federal program. And so more and more, the cities have been left to themselves to kind of deal with these issues. But that said, housing is a piece of it. It's not the only issue. We really do need to continue to look at the issues of mental illness and addiction. And so when you look at...
How many people who live in your residence groups are working poor? Do you know? Do you have
a very small percentage. I
Yeah.
mean, one of the areas that BRC chooses to focus, it's not the only area that needs focus, but it's been our history going back to our origins on the Bowery, are people with behavioral health challenges, people struggling with addiction and mental illness. That said, we also operate programs, because we don't put people in boxes, to help people get back to work. So when you're sober, there's got to be a reason to stay sober, and part of it is you have to feel good about yourself with a job and a home. So we have very good results. We have about 450 people a year enter our employment programs, about 300 a year get jobs, and about 2/3 of them, as I said, are still working 6 months later.
So that's great.
Yeah.
So what do we do? Do you have any plan? Do you have, I mean, you must have some ideas about how we could really make some significant differences.
I do. Like I said, first and foremost, there's no question that the conversation has to start with housing. There has to be new ideas, creative strategies. I'm glad it's being talked about by both candidates in the campaign to create housing that's affordable. Of course, what we mean by affordable, everybody wants affordable housing. You want your housing to be affordable, I want mine, but there's also has to be affordable housing to very poor people. And so it's going to cost us more to invest in that, but are there creative ways to leverage existing resources to do that? I think there are. We're working on some ourselves, and when and if they actually come to fruition, I'll share them with you.
The incentives that are given to developers now, developers of luxury housing or something, if they provide affordable housing someplace else, but that's I mean, that by definition is still not taking care of the people you're talking about.
It's not for folks who are earning $15,000 a year, $20,000 a year, and who are single, don't have families, and what have you.
And they don't want those people in their buildings.
Well, I don't know them. I don't know whether they want them or not.
I don't think they do.
We've developed them, and the nonprofits have done a good job of developing those kinds of programs. So I think there's room to
add a little
for everybody, and to find those developers who are interested in doing it, because they're out there, and we've worked with them, and we develop housing ourselves. But I think we have to accept that shelters are a necessity of our society, and I'm not even going to say a necessary evil. They're a necessary good. You know, we look at hospitals, and when they close, we get upset because we see hospitals as a resource in our community for healing. And there is this misperception, somewhat informed by a little bit of fact, but not the preponderance of the data, that shelters are a place where nothing happens. Partly the word, the language. You know, we look at them as residential treatment centers.
Can we change the name?
Right? Can we change the name? Can we change the language? Can we change the perception? We need to do a better marketing job. There's no question about it.
Can we add more social services?
And those places need to have them. We run the most effective mental health shelters in the city. The city puts out a scorecard every quarter, and consistently the top 2 mental health shelters in the system are 2 BRC shelters, one in Chelsea, one in Harlem. And so we need to have shelters. We need to see them as a place of hope and opportunity. We need to look at the data to make sure they are, and those shelters that are effective in getting results, we should celebrate that we have a place. Because no matter how much housing gets built, A, it's going to take a while, and B, there's going to be a need. Very few landlords are going to be willing to rent to somebody coming in off the street. So people need a place to go to heal. And as you've mentioned, with the downsizing of the mental health system in the state, which started back when you cited it in the 60s and the 70s, and has continued to this day, the downsizing, not a bad thing, of our prisons and correctional facilities as mental health facilities, because they're not good as mental health facilities. We need a place for people to go.
It's interesting because we think we're doing good things, but the results bring bad results sometimes.
Right, they're just not thought through, right?
Yeah.
It's a game of chess, not checkers.
Yeah.
And it takes time, and we need to learn. So we've learned a lot over these years since the litigation started, you know, back 30 years ago.
When you say litigation, what do we mean?
So
Willowbrook, or?
Well, that's a different one. But
Okay.
so the homeless shelter system in New York City, as some may know, only place in the country and only social service system in the city. You know, we have a lot of others. We have welfare and child welfare and adult protective services and a variety of things. and even criminal justice, all used to have client rights or user rights, participant rights litigation around them because they were horribly run. The jails were horribly run, the child welfare system was horribly run in the past, and there needed to be reform. And there needed to be reform in the shelter system, and so litigation was brought in the late 70s to bring that reform, and it took a while for those reforms to get into place. But we now have a dramatically reformed system. And I think another key piece to how we get—
What does that mean? Tell me.
Well, when we started, it was shelter. It was a place for somebody who didn't have a place to go
To have
and
a bed.
sleep. And so we had the old armories, Washington Heights, Bedford and Atlantic Avenues, and they had these old drill floors. The military folk will remember these because they drilled on them, they trained on them, cavernous facilities, and hundreds upon hundreds of beds laid out in rows. Not attractive places that people wanted to go, not places that offered help. The kind of term of art at the time was 3 hots and a cot. They were probably not even hot meals, they were probably cold and a cot, but not the sense of goal orientation, not the sense of what are your needs, how do we help you achieve them, how do we help you transition from dependence to independence, to self-sufficiency, and to address your health needs, the underlying issues. We've done that. We actually now have a system that creates pressures on itself that it doesn't have to do. We now have teams, BRC and many other organizations in this town, that are on the streets, in the subways, at the bus terminals, the train stations, whatever, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week,
Looking for
encouraging people to come in, motivating them to come in, not criminalizing the behavior, but saying, don't you aspire to do better? Wouldn't you rather have a hand up than a hand out? We last year placed over 2,000 men and women from the streets, from the subways, into residential programs. That creates more pressure on the system. Now, the lawsuit says, going back 30 years ago, there must be a bed for everybody who asks. And it more or less stops there. I mean, it talks about how many toilets there should be for every number of people.
Square feet around beds.
Right, which makes you realize how barbaric it was back then.
Terrible.
But now you go into shelters and they're bright and they're motivating and people don't want to leave. It's not that they don't want to come in.
In your shelters.
Right, back in the days under Mayor Koch, we had shelters and there was no line to get in because you really needed to be desperate.
Right.
Now there's a waiting list. There are people who are almost dying to get into the right place, which is why I talked before about effective shelters that get results. But we also need to be able to say, and this is where the litigation becomes an impediment, at some point, if you're not taking advantage of this opportunity, we're not going to judge you for it. It doesn't make you a bad person. But if you could get a job and you won't, if there's an apartment available but you don't like where it is, and this isn't everybody, but it's the marginal amount, rather than opening more shelters because these folks won't leave, because we should have as many shelters as we need, but not beyond that, then maybe it's time for you to give up this resource for somebody else who needs it and wants it and will do something with it until you're ready.
Yeah.
Now, the legal advocates who are holding on to this 30-year-old consent decree will say, you're going to throw a homeless person out on the street? Well, we walk the streets every day and we see homeless people who want to get in. And so we've got to find the right balance. The litigation, we've been able to get rid of it in all these other areas. It really constrains, I know this from having been in government, and from being in the nonprofit sector, it really constrains us from taking risks, to find solutions, right? We're learning this from all the social entrepreneurs. You have to have a tolerance for risk. You have to have a tolerance for failure to be able to try new ideas.
Oh, well, always.
And the litigation impedes that because
So do you
they go
sit
into
down
court.
with the people who are litigating or who are enforcing the results of prior litigation to discuss this?
Well, of course, it's not about me, right? The litigation is against the city and the state.
Right.
And so Mayor Koch, Mayor Dinkins, Mayor Giuliani, Mayor Bloomberg, and Mayor Loder de Blasio, but all those who have been mayor already have tried to no real success. Governor Cuomo the first, Governor Pataki, Governor Spitzer, Governor Patterson, Governor Cuomo the second, have all tried. And there is this, this kind of absolutist, which I respect, ideal that until there's housing for everybody. I mean, they would argue we shouldn't build more shelters, that shelters are bad, build more housing. I'd love to be in a world that we don't need shelters, but we do.
Yeah.
When we lost Section 8, the city introduced a new
Rent
voucher, rent subsidy, but with only city resources, not federal resources, you know, and it's not just New York City that's getting the short end of the stick, it's cities across the country. It is one of the disappointments is the loss of an urban agenda that we used to have, even though 70% of Americans live in or near a city. And so the city created something, half a loaf, better than no loaf, but not the whole loaf, which was a 2-year subsidy that then would, not as good as Section 8, but something. And the advocates fought that, and now it's gone. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing more people.
When we talk about addiction, what are we talking about?
We're talking about everything. We're talking about legal addictions, alcohol and over-the-counter drugs, and we're talking about the old standards, heroin, cocaine.
Is there a larger group? Is there any, any cause or any form of addiction that's larger than the others?
No. I mean, the opiate abuse is still prevalent.
Is methadone readily available?
It is, but a lot of people don't like it, and it comes with its own stigma. So there's been a lot of progress made in addiction treatment. But you know, what's ironic, and you know, not a bad thing necessarily to focus on obesity and the size of containers that we drink sugary drinks in. But what about alcohol and the size of containers, right? No one's downsizing the 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor. I'm not for prohibition, but I think the Bloomberg administration did a great job on focusing on an issue like smoking, like obesity, with a public relations campaign. I mean, my kids, they cover their eyes, they run out of the room when those smoking, you know, with the woman without her fingers and the guy on the breathing out of his, you know, and
we need to do that about other things.
We need to do that about alcohol.
Especially with the medical consequences. The diseases of liver, the diabetes, I mean, they are very expensive.
And we're seeing it. We have a community health center embedded in 2 of our facilities. In our detox, which is one of the most effective detoxes in the city, measured by the fact that 72% of our patients, clients move on to further treatment.
Is there a waiting list to get into it?
Not thankfully, only because not a lot of addicts are ready, right? But when they are, we're able to serve them. And one of, you know, we've added capacity to our ability to do that. But we embed in it, you know, not just alcohol treatment or drug treatment, but understanding why somebody's using and all those other issues. A lot of our clients are self-medicating a mental health disorder. And so we have a psychiatrist in the detox to help folks get that kind of help, because you know, one of my favorite addicts is a great actor, Robert Downey Jr. And he was being interviewed once, and a reporter said to him, "So why do you have such a hard time getting sober?" And he looked at her kind of cross-eyed and said, "I don't have a hard time getting sober. I get sober all the time." And so getting sober is not a measure of success per se.
Relapse.
Because unless you understand why you're using, and unless you're working and willing to try the tools to deal with those things, because life is tough and whatever triggers were out there are still going to be out there. It's not a, you know, I shouldn't say wine and roses, but you know, it's, and so we need to understand those things. And you're right, health is huge. We see 75% of the folks coming in off the street with chronic health issues, heart disease, diabetes, hepatitis, you name it.
Do we come up with a sufficiently broad program? I mean, it's such a, there are so many feeders into the system, right? Even the court system, the prisons, as you said, mental health hospitals. You can't keep somebody in a hospital for mental illness unless they agree or you can prove different things. There's so many impediments to really solving this or trying to come up with some reasonable solutions.
There is. It's amazing that success happens given all the constraints.
And so much money that we really need. I mean, it is a major, major problem.
Well, we spend a lot. You know, when I was commissioner, our budget was just under $500,000 a year, and now it's close to $1 billion a year. And yet the problem is still there. And again, you know, the need is there.
Does it not have a proper place on the agendas of people?
It doesn't. I think we've unfortunately come to accept it as just a condition of urban living. We
were able to put it over the side. These are people who just can't make it or they got problems and
we've almost dehumanized them, not criminalized them per se. And actually the police department is one of our greatest allies and resources in working together. the evolution of thinking in the police department of understanding addiction and mental illness and trying to get people matched with services has really been phenomenal and profound, and we do a lot of work with them. The police department has their own dedicated homeless outreach unit. But we need to do a better job at striking the right balance between individual liberties and societal needs. And this is not about homelessness, right? We're seeing, thankfully, a bit of a percolating of discussion every now and then when there's a tragedy around mental health. We don't want to go back to the way things were, because that didn't work, of just locking people up forever or taking radical approaches through medicine to them. But a lot of progress has been made with medication. You know, I think if you watch Homeland, they do a phenomenal job of really helping appreciate the challenges and the demons of this horrible disease. And it's a disease that kills. But we can do a better job. Right now, the only way that somebody can be involuntarily helped is if they are an immediate risk, if I was about to lunge at you with a knife. But if I talk about it and plot it and lay out plans and have notes and everything, that's not good enough.
And then when it happens, a mentally ill person goes in and shoots a lot of people, it gets segregated into gun control and mental health, but it doesn't get connected to other people who need the same help, who are potentially, the next step would be that.
Well, right, and that's the tragedy, of course, is then everybody with a mental health disorder is labeled as a potential murderer, and they're not. But they're people who are sick. It's just, you know, if you saw somebody have a heart attack on the street, if you saw somebody hit by a car.
911.
Right away, right? No hesitation, get them help. And there wouldn't be a lot of debate about whether or not they're going to the hospital, right? They're getting in the ambulance, they're going to the hospital.
Right.
But we see people who are effectively bleeding and dying on our streets, but it's just not transparent, it's not visible. And we've come to accept it as a condition of the human existence. We shouldn't. We actually have not a 911. They're not going to die this minute. But we have a helpline that the public can call. It's 212-533-5151. We're kind of hoping to develop it into social media and smartphone applications and stuff like that.
And you have a website.
We have a website, brc.org, and you can email us there. We'll respond. But that's why it's so important to offer a hand up, not a hand out. I mean, I understand the frustration. You want to help somebody, you don't know what to do, to give them $1, to give them a sandwich. And I'm not saying per se you shouldn't do it, but that's not going to change their life. In fact, it's going to perpetuate their life as it is. And we want to motivate them at BRC to believe that they can have a life better than they have.
Do you do outreach in the courts?
We do. We actually have a reentry program focused on the mentally ill who cycle in and out, right? They come out of jail mentally ill. They've been getting treatment in jail, but their lawyers don't say, you know, let Muzzy stay a little bit longer. Let him finish his treatment, whether it's detox or it's psych or whatever, you know, because it's seen as punitive and this person should be free. So they leave. They have a prescription. But where do they go? I met a guy, not even at the jails, but I was going to a game at Madison Square Garden. A guy was panhandling, and I said, as I usually do, well, what do you need it for? Maybe, you know, keep the change and I can get you help that you don't have to pay for. Long story short, he had been discharged from the hospital, having had gangrene and having his toes amputated. A week earlier, you know, he pulled out all his papers to prove it to me. I said, you don't have to prove it. I take you at your word. And, you know, the paper said, like, when we leave the hospital, right, go home.
Take this.
Right, follow up with your physician, get these prescriptions filled, have your dressings changed daily, you know, by a nurse. You know, he's like, I'm homeless.
What do I do?
What do I do? And I said, well, come to us. We'll take care of that. Because it's not about shelter. It's got to look at the person. It's got to be holistic. And what we do not because the litigation mandates it. We do it because we're mission-driven and we're person-driven.
I have two questions, and we're almost at the end of the program.
Oh,
one is, where did you get the name Muzzy?
My mother gave it to me.
Is it the real name?
It's not the real name. I need to have an alias.
Okay. I won't even ask you what the real name is. All right. It's a nickname, but you've used it as
It is. It's,
my name is a nickname also.
It's four. Are you going to tell me your?
Roslyn. Okay. R-O-S-L-Y-N-N.
So, yeah, you know, I every now and then I try to go back to my legal name. And
which is?
If you don't know, I won't tell you.
Okay.
And every, you know, my mom didn't make my mom happy.
Okay.
You know my mom.
I know.
So keeping my mom happy is important. So
now,
I finally decided, don't fight mom.
A more important question.
Which, you know, it's a word in English.
It is?
Yes, it means confused.
Oh, and that's not you. It's too bad.
I wonder sometimes.
your budget is what?
At BRC,
Yeah.
we're about $65 million a year.
And does most of that money come from contracts with the city?
City, state, and federal government.
City, state,
yes.
and federal government. So are most of the services that supposedly the city provides, are they all done through contracts with other organizations?
So the contracts fund the core of what we do. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And it's a double-edged sword of having an incredibly generous government system, regardless of who's in office. It is just part of that is New York.
Well, they need you.
Right. But that said, what makes us exceptional, what makes us effective, and again, I think we need to have effective shelters, is philanthropy. So even though philanthropic dollars are only 5% of our income, for example, we have the best shelters in the city because we have this great employment program. So the city gives us a few $1 million to run our shelters, and we collect $750,000 through philanthropy to run our employment program. But it's that employment program, 100% privately funded, that enables those guys to get the jobs that put money in their pocket that they can get out of the shelter. And so the public-private partnership is imperative.
So we need a more active citizenry.
Always, more is better. There's no question about that. But we do have a very active, I want to make sure that that's clear.
Did you came from a family of activists?
No, I mean, social
Interested.
conscious,
Yeah.
yes. You know, and growing up in the city in the 70s when things were terrible, you know, first I was like, you know, I was going to bring peace to the world, and then I'm like, cultivate my own garden, my own backyard. And there's still a lot of work to do right here.
And how? Well, you've certainly outlined it, and you do a wonderful job, and we thank you very much. And
with your help and support.
I hope you'll come back again.
I'd love to.
Thank you, Muzzy.
You're welcome.
Rosenblatt. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.